Welcome to Chapter 4, Religion in the United States, Denominationalism and Beyond. This chapter focuses specifically on the American religious landscape, which is unique in many ways. Our textbook opens with a provocative observation. Americans have been called the most religious people on the face of the earth. But what does this actually mean? The text notes that organized religion in the U.S. is a bundle of contradictions. It's simultaneously deeply sacred and lightly layered over secular culture, both an unyielding rock of ages and given to fleeting faddishness. This chapter serves as what your textbook calls a preliminary catalog of the many ways one can be religious in the United States. We'll explore how American religion is organized, how it has changed over time, and what makes it distinctly American. The chapter will cover church sect theory as a framework for understanding religious organization, denominationalism as the characteristically American form of religious pluralism, congregationalism as a key organizing principle, and the changing landscape of mainline versus evangelical fundamentalist Christianity. As we work through this material, keep in mind that American religion is characterized by both remarkable stability in core belief and tremendous changeability in organizational forms and practices. This combination makes it fascinating to study sociologically. This discussion question asks you to think about the claim that Americans are the most religious people on earth. How so? What are prominent characteristics of religion in America? So our text provides several answers. First, the belief in God remains extraordinarily high. As of 2023, nearly 74% of Americans say they believe in God. This is much higher than in most other industrialized democracies. In many European countries, belief in God is below 50%. Belief in an afterlife is also strong. About 67% envision paradise and heaven, while 59% believe in hell. These numbers have remained relatively stable over time. Church attendance. While church attendance is somewhat declining, it remains higher in the U.S. than in comparable societies. About 30% of Americans attend religious services more frequently than monthly as of 2021. Religious affiliations. While religious nuns, NONES, have grown to about 29 to 30% of the population, this still means about 70% claim some religious identity. This is higher than many European nations where religious nuns can be 50% or more. But your text notes there's complexity here. Americans are religious in distinct ways. Religion is voluntary. You choose whether to participate. It's denominational. There are many competing religious organizations that coexist peacefully. It's congregational. Local communities of believers are central. And it's changeable. People switch denominations, religious movements rise and fall, and new forms emerge. So when we say Americans are highly religious, we're talking about a specific kind of religiosity that's characteristically American. Voluntary, pluralistic, congregationally based, and dynamic. So here is a sneak preview of Chapter 4. Let me walk you through the roadmap. First, church sect theory. It's our analytical framework that we'll be using. It is what our text calls the most important middle range theory in sociology of religion. It helps us understand different types of religious organization and how they relate to society. The condition of generality is necessary for denominations to coexist peacefully. Your textbook emphasizes that American denominations accept a principle. They emphasize what's general about religion rather than their specific theological differences. This allows peaceful coexistence. We'll also explore denominationalism as characteristically American pattern of religious organizations. Unlike European state churches or rigid sex church divisions, America developed this unique voluntary system. We'll examine congregationalism, the principle that religious authority resides in local communities of believers rather than hierarchical church structures. This principle, rooted in early American Protestantism, has shaped all American religion. We'll look at religious realignment, how the lines dividing American religious groups have shifted from denominational boundaries to ideological ones, conservative versus liberal. We'll analyze the decline of mainline Protestantism and the rise of evangelical fundamentalist Christianity since the 1960s. And we'll explore the growth of the religious nones, N-O-N-E-S, people with no religious preference, which is one of the most dramatic trends in recent American religion. Throughout Chapter 4, we're asking, what makes American religion distinctively American? This slide introduces foundational context, churches and sects in America, early America. Our text makes a critical historical point. When the U.S. was founded, its population was overwhelmingly Protestant. Several European nations had declared for Protestantism early, but the U.S. was unique in having its religious roots virtually entirely in Protestant soil. So here's what's fascinating. From the nation's beginnings, religious affiliation was an option. This was revolutionary. In most of the world, historically, you were born into a religious system. Your religion came with your nationality, your religion, your region, your family. You did not choose it. But in America, from the start, religion was voluntary. The First Amendment guaranteed free exercise of religion and prohibited establishment of a state religion. This created an entirely new religious situation. Your book explains that this led to denominationalism, an institutional pattern that both governs relations among churches and organizes contact between them and the wider community. This slide quotes the definition, an institutional pattern that both governs relations among the churches and organizes contact between them and the wider community. The system originated in Protestantism, but has shaped all American religions. Even Catholics, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus all must adapt to this characteristically American pattern. As one commentator noted, even the Catholics are Protestants in how they now handle church membership. This voluntaristic, pluralistic, denominational system is the defining feature of American religion. Everything else flows from this foundational pattern. Let's define what we mean by denomination more precisely. Our slide quotes the definition. A denomination is a voluntary, religious association with a specific purpose, the propagation of its point of view, which in some sense holds to be true. So let me unpack this very carefully. First, we're looking at voluntary religious association. You choose to join. You're not born into it automatically. You can leave. You can switch to another denomination. The voluntary character is essential. The specific purpose. Denominations exist to promote their particular understanding of religious truth and to gather like-minded people together. Propagation of its point of view. Denominations actively recruit, evangelize, educate, and spread their message, which in some sense holds to be true. Here's a crucial nuance. Denominations believe their perspective is true, but in the American context, they also acknowledge that other denominations have legitimate alternative perspectives. They don't claim an absolute monopoly on religious truth in a way that would delegitimize other denominations. Our text emphasizes that denominations rely not on compulsion supplied by political enforcement, but on autonomous energies of like-hearted and like-minded individuals. This is a key difference from state churches that can use government power to support religion. The denomination is the organizational form that dominant religion traditions assume in a pluralistic culture. In pluralism, you may belong to any denomination or none at all. This makes American religion fundamentally different from religious monopolies. Church sect theory is the most important middle range theory in sociology of religion. The slide shows three key theorists: Ernst Troeltsch, Max Weber, and Richard Niebuhr. Max Weber first attached church and sect to sociological concepts in his essays on the Protestant ethic at the turn of the 20th century. For Weber, these were ideal types, mental constructs used for comparison, not standards to which groups are compared, but tools by which they are compared. Ernst Troeltsch, a theologian and Weber's contemporary, popularized church sect theory in his Social Teaching of the Christian Churches, 1912 in German. Troeltsch modified Weber's approach in important ways, and that created advances and problems. Niebuhr brought church sect theory to American audiences with the Social Sources of Denominationalism in 1929. Niebuhr's work added the crucial element of seeing church and sect as poles of a continuum rather than discrete categories, and analyzing the dynamic process as groups move along this continuum. Note that understanding some confusion and debate in contemporary usage requires reviewing how these concepts fit into Weber's sociology and how Troeltsch modified them. The theory traveled across the Atlantic in complicated ways due to translation timing. Troeltsch's work was translated from German in 1931, but Weber's work wasn't available until 1949. This meant concepts were available before the rules for the use. So now we're going to explore each of these theories' contributions. Your textbook explains that Weber's sociology is united by the overarching theme of rationalization of action. He was trying to understand why capitalism developed most completely in the Anglo-American culture. For Weber, the critical differentiating variable between church and sect was mode of membership. Church equals membership by birth. You're born into a church. It is the default religious organization of a society. Membership is assumed based on being born in a particular place or to particular parents. Sect is membership by decision. You choose to join. You make a conscious commitment. Membership requires some demonstration of faith or commitment. This is clean, clear, and empirically observable. You can determine mode of membership relatively directly. The ideal type methodology is crucial here. Your textbook explains that church and sect serve to enable two or more religious organizations to be compared to each other. Like an inch in measurement, they facilitate comparison. They're not standards to which organizations are compared, but tools by which they are compared. This is a crucial methodological point. Weber wasn't classifying religions as good as bad, pure or compromised. He was creating analytical tools for comparison. It's value-free, scientific approach focused on understanding empirical patterns. This clarity got lost somewhat as the theory developed, and we'll see this on the following slides. So your slide quotes the definition of an ideal type. So let me break this down. A mental construct. It's not a description of any actual organization. It's a conceptual tool created by the researcher based on relevant empirical components. The researcher selects elements from real organizations that are relevant to the comparison being made. Formed and explicitly delineated by the researcher. The researcher clearly defines what the characteristics the ideal type includes. It's not vague or implicit. To facilitate precise comparisons. Well, the purpose is comparison. You can compare actual organizations to the ideal type or compare two organizations by reference to how each relates to the ideal type. Your textbook gives the analogy of measurement. An inch is a mental construct, but you can't find a perfect inch in nature. But it allows precise comparison. Similarly, church and sect are ideal types that allow us to compare religious organizations precisely. Weber developed this methodology to solve a dilemma. How could sociology be scientific when it studies meaningful human interaction that must be interpretively understood? The ideal type method allows systematic, rigorous comparison while still attending to meaning. So this is sophisticated social science methodology. Understanding it helps you use church-sect theory properly, rather than misusing it to judge or categorize religious groups. This slide focuses on Troeltsch's contribution, accommodation or compromise. Your textbook explains that in the transition from Weber to Troeltsch, social teaching of the Christian churches, the church-sect typology underwent significant alterations. Troeltsch was not a social scientist, but a theologian, attempting to relate types of religious experience to varieties of social teachings. This shift in purpose changed the theory. There were key changes Troeltsch made. First, he shifted emphasis from organization to behavior. Instead of focusing on mode of membership, organizational, he focused on accommodation or compromise, behavioral. Second, he stressed accommodation or compromise as distinguishing between different religious styles. Churches accommodate or compromise with society. Sects reject such accommodation. Third, he added a third type, mysticism. He proposed church, sect, and mystical types. Your textbook notes a crucial problem. While mode of membership can be ascertained relatively directly, accommodation has a more mediated character. What is and is not accommodation is more evaluative. It depends on one's perspective. This shift moved the theory from a purely sociological framework toward a theological one. It introduced an evaluative element. Churches could be seen as compromised, sects as pure. This isn't value-neutral sociology. It's theology influencing sociological analysis. Your textbook emphasizes that what Troeltsch calls sociological formulation of a theological question has been misidentified with Weber's attempt to analyze a sociological problem. These are different projects with different goals. This addresses Niebuhr's contribution, dynamic process in creating a continuum. Niebuhr's Social Sources of Denominationalism from 1929 was the first major U.S. publication to use church sect types. Niebuhr was another sociologically inclined theologian. Your textbook notes that though Niebuhr's work was sometimes possessed by rather naive evolutionism and a narrow perspective, it contributed a significant element lacking in earlier treatments. His key contribution is he used church and sect as poles of a continuum rather than as discrete categories. Religion moves along a continuum. Look at the diagram showing movement from sect toward church and denomination. Niebuhr didn't merely classify groups as sect-like or church-like. He analyzed the dynamic process of religious history as groups move along the continuum. His thesis is that new religious organizations, sects, begin among the socially disinherited, but in the U.S., as these groups attained higher social status, their religious expressions become more respectable or socially acceptable. Thus, there's a movement across generations, from sectarian to denominational religious life, or else the sectarian group dies out. For an example, Methodism in the U.S. provides the classic example of sects to denomination process. Your textbook notes an unfortunate result. Niebuhr's work lent a concrete character to the types and hypothetical continuum. This contained seeds for church-sect theory to develop into an evaluative device quite outside the sociological frame of reference in which it was conceived. Let's compare three key scholars who developed church-sect typology. Max Weber, the sociologist, first introduced these terms as analytical tools. Church and sect were ideal types to understand different religious organization. Churches are inclusive, you are born into them. Sects require voluntary adult commitment. Ernst Troeltsch, a theologian, refined Weber's framework by adding a third category, the mystical type, for individualized inward spirituality. He also emphasized that these types reflect different theological approaches to relating faith and society. Churches accommodate the world, sect rejects it. Niebuhr brought these European concepts to America and made a crucial innovation. He viewed church and sect not as fixed categories, but as poles on a continuum. Religious groups fall somewhere along the spectrum and can move over time. Niebuhr showed that sects tend to become more church-like as they grow and gain second-generation members, what we call denominalization. All three use comparative methods but differently. Weber compared religions across cultures globally. Troeltsch compared Christian movements across European history, and Niebuhr analyzed the dynamic processes of how American religious groups move along the continuum over time. So the key takeaway is that Weber gave us the basic framework. Troeltsch added theological depth and the mystical type, and Niebuhr made it dynamic and applicable to American religion. Together, they provided powerful tools for analyzing any religious organization, its characteristics, relation to society, and how it changed over time. Let's talk about where denominations stand in contemporary society. The religious landscape today looks very different from what Weber, Troeltsch, and Niebuhr observed. First, competition is restrained. What does this mean? In earlier periods of American history, denominations competed vigorously for members. Think of revival meetings, missionaries, and heated theological debates between Baptists and Methodists or Catholics and Protestants. Today, that competitive edge has dulled significantly. Most mainstream denominations now emphasize cooperation over competition, participate in ecumenical dialogues, and recognize each other's legitimacy. This restraint reflects broader cultural shifts toward religious tolerance and pluralism. Second, let's look at historical context. In the past, the largest bodies of believers were Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, what sociologist Will Herberg called the triple melting pot of American religion in his 1955 book, Protestant, Catholic, Jew. These were the dominant players in religious identity in America, largely meant belonging to one of these three groups. The framework shaped American religious life for much of the 20th century, but over time, tensions between these groups have subsided considerably. The intense Protestant-Catholic conflicts that once dominated American religious life, think anti-Catholic sentiment, questions about whether a Catholic could become president, or Catholics building separate school systems, those tensions have largely faded. Similarly, interfaith dialogue between Christian and Jews has increased dramatically. What was once sharp boundaries have become more permeable. Intermarriage rates have risen, theological animosity has decreased, and cooperative efforts on social issues are common. Now here's the critical question. Is the picture changing? Can we still detect the lines of competing parties, or has the landscape shifted so fundamentally that we need new frameworks? The answer is complex. On one hand, the old Protestant Catholic Jewish framework doesn't capture Americans' contemporary religion. We now have significant Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and Sikh population. We have growing numbers of nones, people who claim no religious affiliation. We have megachurches and non-denominational movements that do not fit traditional denomination structures. On the other hand, new lines of competition have emerged, not between denominations as much as between theological orientations. The real divisions today often cut across denominational boundaries: progressive versus conservative, traditional versus contemporary worship, exclusive versus inclusive theology. A progressive Methodist may have more in common with a progressive Presbyterian than with a conservative Methodist. So denominations today occupy an interesting space, less competitive with each other in the traditional sense, but facing new challenges from religious individualism, declining membership, and internal theological polarization. The denominational form itself is being questioned as younger generations increasingly identify as spiritual but not religious, or simply Christian without denominational attachment. Robert Wuthnows, The Restructuring of American Religion, identified a major shift in how religious groups are organized in America. Instead of the old denominational divisions, Baptist versus Methodist, Lutheran versus Presbyterian, Wuthnow showed that denominations are now divided internally into two camps: conservatives and liberals, or traditionalist and progressive. And this split cuts across denominational lines. A conservative Presbyterian has more in common with a conservative Methodist than with a liberal Presbyterian. These internal divisions have led to two major changes in the United States religion structure. First, denominationalism itself is waning. People care less about denominational labels and more about theological orientation. You see this in the rise of non-denominational churches and people identifying simply as Christian rather than denomination. Second, special interest movements with narrower objectives have formed. Think of the Moral Majority, the Religious Right, Interfaith Social Justice Coalition. These cross-denominational alliances form around specific issues like abortion, LGBTQ rights, environmental justice, or economic policy rather than traditional theological distinctives. The key takeaway: the action in American religion today isn't between denominations, it's within them. This restructuring explains why religious conflicts today look so different from the past. Understanding this realignment helps us make sense of our contemporary religious politics and see why denominations often seem more fractured than unified. Culture wars is a term for conflicts across denominational lines around social and moral issues. The slide notes divisions are no longer ecclesiastical but more cosmological. What this means is there are differing assumptions about values, purpose, truth, freedom, and the collective identity. James David Hunter's work on culture wars emphasizes that the battle lines in American religion have shifted. Instead of Protestant versus Catholics versus Jews, we now have progressives across all traditions who share assumptions about individual autonomy, social justice, sexual freedom, environmental responsibility, etc., versus traditionalist conservatives across all traditions who share assumptions about traditional family values, sexual morality, religious authority. A more liberal Episcopalian may have more in common with a liberal Catholic or Reformed Jew than a conservative Episcopalian. Similarly, a conservative Baptist may align more closely with a conservative Catholic than with a liberal Baptist. Issues that divide along these lines include gender roles and women's ordination, LGBTQ plus rights and same-sex marriage, abortion, environmental policy, immigration, education policy, religious freedom versus anti-discrimination law. Your textbook notes that attention is turned away from ecumenical activity between denominations. There's no need to negotiate peace among non-combatants. The action is elsewhere along this progressive conservative axis. The growth of non-denominational and parachurch organizations is seen as part of this process. People organize around shared values rather than shared denominational heritage. By the 1970s, women were experiencing better opportunities in the workforce. Many worked outside the home. Denominations that declined most endured gender equality. Those that gained reinforced differentiated gender roles. Your textbook makes a crucial observation. The uniformity and universally greater interest of women in all phases of religious practices is well documented. Women are more religious than men across virtually all measures. Women's role in denominations historically were that women maintained denominational life through voluntary activities. Women's auxiliaries, mission societies, Sunday schools, social events. This volunteer labor was essential to congregational vitality. Beginning in the 1960s and 70s, more women entered the paid workforce in higher education. This had major consequences, especially for mainline Protestant, which declined, and it was at least partly due to increased presence of women in the workforce, resulting in corresponding absence of women to undertake volunteer activities. Women in mainline denominations, Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and Congregationalists, are more likely to be in the professional class with job responsibilities that don't end with the workday. That is less time for church volunteering. The conservative Protestant growth correlates with denominations that reinforce more differentiated gender roles. These attract membership from working class strata where women working outside the home are relatively more likely to have free time for church activities and less likely to experience redefinition of traditional home roles. This isn't the whole story of decline and growth, but it's an important demographic and sociological factor that is often overlooked when people focus only on theology. The term congregationalism emphasizes the role of laity in the church. Most simply, it refers to the Congregational Church, now the United Church of Christ. It also refers to a form of church governance, polity, but most broadly it symbolizes religious voluntarism. Your textbook uses congregationalism in three ways. First, the denomination once called the Congregational Church, now the UCC or United Church of Christ. This body descends from the established Church of New England, formed through Puritan Pilgrim Alliance in the 1600s. Second, a form of polity, church governance. Congregational polity vests governing authority in the local congregation rather than in the hierarchy. The local congregate calls its own minister, decides doctrine and liturgy, owns its property, and controls membership. The broader principle of religious volunteerism is that religion is an entirely voluntary activity. You may go to whatever church you choose, whenever you choose, or not at all. The church serves the needs of the congregation rather than vice versa. By establishing a voluntary basis of financial support, the role of the congregation is considered magnified in America. Unless the church has been well endowed, if the congregation dwindles or leaves, the church must close. Americans worship as well as vote with their feet and their pocketbooks. A degree of accommodation to this aspect of the American way of life is inherent in all religious practices in the United States. All U.S. churches are Congregationalists in this radical way, even if they have Episcopal or Presbyterian polity formally. Your textbook discusses how in the mid-1970s all of the U.S. appeared caught up in a broad-based religious enthusiasm after a period of apparent decline in the 1960s. Commentators saw religiousness everywhere. Religion was in. What explained this transformation? How did the country move from religious revival in the 50s to secularity in the 60s, back to the pious devotion in the 70s, and to new patterns today? Well, there is a dual quality of American religious life. On one hand, Americans are remarkably susceptible to taking in whole world views in a single breath from ideological breezes that wave coast to coast. Constantly shifting winds are inevitable in an environment where religious freedom is fiercely defended. As William James wrote, as a rule, we believe as much as we can. We would believe everything if only we could. On the other hand, there exists a solid bedrock of religious belief and practice that remains relatively undisturbed even during turbulent eras. Most Americans believe in God and expect similar belief from fellow citizens aspiring to social respectability. 74% in 2023 believe in God, 67% believe in heaven, and 59% believe in hell. Your textbook argues these skeletal beliefs, though sometimes condemned as superficial, constitute a highly religious people by Benjamin Franklin's standards. Franklin's essential articles, God exists, God governs the world by providence, and the most acceptable service of God is doing good to people. Souls are immortal, crime will be punished, and virtue rewarded. Few contemporary Americans would dissent from this basic creed. It functions as an eternal ethical baseline. The continuity underlines the changeability. Looking at this breakdown, Protestants total 41%. This is based off 2020 Pew data. It's when you combine evangelical Protestants, mainline Protestants, black Protestants, and other groups of Protestants. Roman Catholics are at 21%, unaffiliated is 29%, Jews are 2%, other Christians are 2%, and others are 5%. The Roman Catholic Church is the largest single religious organization in the U.S. About one-fourth of the population claims Catholic allegiance. But if you combine Protestant groups, the U.S. remains a country where a near majority identify as Protestant. The unaffiliated category at 29% is enormous and has grown dramatically. This is one of the most salient statistical trends in recent decades. The proportion claiming no religious preference hovered around 3% in the 60s, doubled to 14% during the 90s, reached 20% by 2012, and is now nearly 30%. African American Protestant churches represent a distinctive position, generally theologically conservative but socioeconomically liberal. About 14% of the U.S. population is African American, but more than three-fourths of African Americans identify with this tradition. The others category is also growing: Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, Sikhs, etc. This threatens the Judeo-Christian canopy that previously characterized American public religion. Your textbook notes that Jews have achieved a special status as related to the Judeo-Christian ethic, but this may be challenged by increasing religious diversity. So let's answer the question, why did mainline religions decline? Well, the slide identifies key factors. Fewer children equals slower church growth. Liberal churches are graying rapidly. These are demographic changes. The birth rate decline among white Christians began in the 1960s, and it is the most important variable. Whether due to economic necessity, concern for zero population growth, or desire for a freer lifestyle through better birth control, Americans dramatically reduced the number of children they were having. Fewer children meant slower church growth, both directly, fewer children in Sunday school, and indirectly. Parents not only brought children to church, but were themselves drawn back into church life they may have partially abandoned. This particularly affected non-immigrant whites of higher socioeconomic status. Hence, it most severely affected moderate and liberal Protestant churches and conservative Reformed Jewish traditions. By the end of the 20th century, Gallup data showed 69% of Americans aged 45 or younger, but 69% of Episcopalians are aged 45 or older. The church was aging rapidly. Conservative Christians provide a clear contrast: marry at earlier age than average, stay married longer, have larger families, and keep offspring in the church longer. Liberal churches host older couples with fewer children who leak away at higher rates. Their congregations are graying quickly with higher attrition by death. While belief and value issues shouldn't be discounted, in many respects, the driving force behind conservative church expansion and mainline decline are largely demographic. Demography is destiny for churches. Persons with no religious preference, the religious nones, have been growing. Who are they? Relatively few are secular, agnostic, or atheist. Most actually pray. Their most distinguishing feature is they avoid churches. Your textbook discusses the work of Michael Hout and Claude Fisher, showing that this is a startling, rapid social change, one of the most dramatic proportional changes in survey data. Most are believers of some sort, and many are quite conventional. They are unchurched believers rather than skeptics who lost faith. The most distinguishing feature is avoidance of churches, not lack of belief or spirituality. Relatively few are secular, agnostic, or atheist. Most actually pray. This category is highly heterogeneous, ranging from committed believers who shun involvement in churches to avowed atheists for whom the idea of deity is irrational. The key fact about people who express no religious preference is that most are believers of some sort. Their most distinguishing feature is their avoidance of churches. This challenges simple secularization narratives. Americans aren't becoming massively irreligious or atheistic. There's a disconnect between personal spirituality and organized religion. Many describe themselves as spiritual, but not religious. Even university students who consider themselves neither spiritual nor religious often engage in practices and hold beliefs that sociologists would classify as religious. So, how do we explain the rise in the religious nuns? Well, there's loss of support for accepting moral direction from church authorities and aversion to conservative social movements seen as taking over denominations. Second, cohort secession, replacement of older, more traditional persons with younger, more autonomous ones. But one of the reasons is anti-political alienation. Former members' quarrel was not with God, but with people running organized religion. They expressed little confidence in religious leaders and churches, seeing them as sources of conflict and intolerance. Many were less seriously committed members who lost support for accepting direction on morality from church authorities. They're also aversive to conservative social movements that they believe have taken over Christian denominations. A cohort secession, a normal demographic sequence, where deceased members are replaced by persons who are not as religious as their parents. Over time, collective commitment diminishes without any individual changing their mind. The religious landscape changes because of a change of people, not because people change. Why might younger cohorts incline toward more secular stances? Our text cites research showing that widely increasing public expenditures on education in democratic nations depress church attendance. Where you stand depends on where you've been sitting, and most youthful sitting occurs in schools. Formal education, especially in secular universities, tends to reduce religious commitment through exposure to pluralistic worldviews, critical thinking about traditional beliefs, and peer groups less tied to religion. The combination of these factors drives the growth of the religious nuns. Additionally, the others category is growing. Church attending is down to about 30% attending more than monthly. Denominational switching occurs but tends to stay within families. Liberals switch among liberal denominations, conservatives among conservatives. The others category is growing and threatens the integrity of the Judeo-Christian moral canopy. Jews had a special place as not quite other in the American society, but increasing diversity challenges this. About 30% attend more than monthly, close to 40% attend sporadically, and about 30% rarely or never attend. Denominational switching does occur, but tends to be religiously intrafamiliar rather than extreme. Liberals move to liberal denominations or moderate denominations, and conservatives stay in a conservative stream. Liberals are also more likely to switch or drop out entirely than conservatives. Catholics switch less than Protestants. Jewish Christian marriages are more likely to lead to dropping out than to conversion, but when conversion occurs, Jews convert to Christianity at about the same rate as Christians convert to Judaism. There were value changes in the 1960s that affected traditional religious worldviews. Some values moderated in conservative direction in the 70s and 80s, and some 60s remedies failed and new threats appeared. Religious groups that compromised least with dominant culture in the 1960s were best poised to benefit from the return to religion, but the gains were not uniform. More expressive styles, Pentecostalism, and media-savvy formats, or mega churches, attracted more people than staid traditional types. This slide focuses on evangelicals and fundamentalism. Fundamentalist membership soared in the 1980s and forward in all of these different groups. The Southern Baptist Convention currently has almost 16 million. In 2000, although numbers are declining partly from conservative domination causing tension. The Assemblies of God, the Pentecostal, has around 3 million. Other groups showing notable gains: Church of God, Jehovah's Witness, Church of the Nazarene, and Seventh-day Adventist. Meanwhile, mainline Protestants are declining. The United Presbyterian Church, the UPC, has fewer than 1.5 million, dropping from its high in 1965 of 3.3 million. The United Methodist Church has been in upheaval, where in 1965 had over 11 million, and by the 2020s had around 6 million. From 2019 to 2023, about 1/4 of the congregations withdrew, and many joined the new Global Methodist Church. An evangelical is a Protestant whose faith in Jesus Christ compels an acceptance of Him as personal Lord and Savior. This act of acceptance customarily follows 1. A confession of one's sinfulness, 2. An acknowledgement of the need to repudiate sin and surrender one's life to Christ, 3. An invitation to Christ to deliver the believer into redemption and holiness through an experience likened to a second birth. Believers who are, quote, born again are expected to exercise reserve and circumspection in personal life, reach out by witnessing about their faith to the unsaved. An evangelical theory of salvation emphasizes a personal relationship with Christ, a born-again conversion experience, biblical authority, although not necessarily literalism, evangelicalism and witnessing, and cruciality of Christ's death and resurrection for salvation. If salvation only through Jesus Christ is the measure, 46% of the evangelicals qualify. If the born-again experience, 31%. If self-identification with the evangelical movement, 17%. If membership in evangelical dominations, 26%. Public opinion data from 1980 showed 38% claimed to have been born again, and 44% had tried to encourage someone to believe in Christ. Fundamentalists share much evangelical background with typically go further in theology and lifestyle. Theological distinctives include biblical literalism. Fundamentalists are ardent proponents of the literal truth of the Bible, while evangelicals respect the Bible and hold it inerrant in matters of faith and practice. Fundamentalists go further with doctrine of literalism. It is basically a materialist view of sacred texts. The fundamentalists regard the word of the text as authoritative in themselves. Their lifestyle distinctions: fundamentalists take serious the biblical call to come out from among them and be separate. They strive to avoid undue entanglement with the things of this world. They routinely shun mass media and other institutions of secular society. They establish their own periodicals, publishers, and schools. Even their churches zealously guard independence. Congregations spurn denominational attachments and interreligious cooperation for fear of weakening their message. Nancy Ackerman stated, "Compromise and accommodation are among the most dreaded words in the fundamentalist vocabulary." The key difference between evangelicals and fundamentalists are evangelicals engage culture while maintaining distinctive beliefs. Fundamentalists separate from culture to preserve purity. Evangelicals are in the world but not of it. Fundamentalists try to be separate from the world entirely. This creates different social dynamics and different relationships to American pluralism. So why are conservative churches growing? Dean Kelly's 1972 book, Why Conservative Churches Are Growing, started the debate. His strictness thesis stated that conservative churches are not reasonable, not tolerant, not ecumenical, and not relevant. And that is exactly those qualities that endow them with vitality. Because members must work, struggle, and sacrifice to remain in good standing, because they must suffer ridicule and rejection, because churches require tangible evidence of commitment, members take membership to heart and find meaning in it. The existential challenge of mainline membership pales in comparison to the daily drama of the Bible believer set against a fallen world. But your textbook shows that this explanation is incomplete. Studies demonstrate that decline of mainline and growth of conservative Christianity occurred without much direct defection and in relative absence of explicit doctrinal references. There are more complete explanations involved. Conservative Christians cultivate close-knit family life, marry younger, stay married longer, have larger families, and socialize their children thoroughly in the faith. As far as retention, there's an emphasis on rearing children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, which creates better retention. Conservative churches efficiently track and recover committed members who become geographical mobile. Studies show 72% of new members in evangelical churches between 1966 and 1970 already identified as evangelical. They were transfers or newcomers to the area, not conversions from the unchurched. Growth represents more circulation among conservative churches than authentic incursion into ranks of the secularized. Even a one-child difference in average family size over generation creates significant membership increase through geometric growth. The combination of these factors explains conservative growth better than theology alone. If you are seeing this during a class, you would write a minute paper, 5 to 10 sentences. Whose study from today's lecture did you find the most intriguing? And then you would turn in your work before leaving class. If you're an online student, you are not required to complete this paper. This concludes Chapter 4. You have now worked through a complex chapter examining church sect theory, congregationalism, the changing landscape of the American religion, the rise of religious nuns, and the role of demographics in religious change.